everybody. Thank you for sharing with us where you're coming from and your altitude. I love it. 11,000 feet. Whoa. I spoke too soon. There we go.
Yeah.
That's the winner.
I think you win.
That's the winner, yeah.
Absolutely. Well,
Do they have an Ikawa?
Yeah. This will be so relevant for you. I can't wait for you to check this out. Well, we called this one How High Altitude and Impacts on Roasting. But hello and thank you for joining. It's funny, every time we do another webinar, I'm even more amazed as to the people we can pull together to accomplish the craziest things that we're able to do. And I got to say that this one did not disappoint at all. It started out as an idea that Joe Marrocco came to us with several months ago. And now after several months of shipping out coffee and setting up ambient sensors and analyzing roast values and studying roast curves and making jokes about today's date, we have arrived. So thank you so much for joining. Before I get any further and do some introductions, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. We have the chat open and we will be going through those at the end. So definitely make sure to be asking questions. And if anybody can beat 11,000 feet, I also put that in the chat. I'll be interested. Anyways, without further ado, my name is Taylor. I'm working at Cropster doing marketing. We also have with us today Eric Stanek from Balzac Brothers. We have Joe Marrocco from List and Beisler. And we have Rob joining us here in a little bit from, of course,
I'm here.
Rob. Oh, he's there.
Oh, wow. Just showing Taylor up.
What up?
Jeez.
Hey. What am I saying?
Well, out of nowhere.
There he is. So good to have. And of course, from Rob, who's consulting. And we also have Alex Giorgio from Ikawa. So thank you all for being here so much. And speaking of thank yous, we also want to thank you to supporters, whether you guys are customers of ours or not. We thank you so much for being here. One of the reasons we love doing webinars is because we get to engage with in different ways than we normally get to. So we're so thankful for that. And speaking of people to be thankful for, my co-host for today, Eric Stanek, I will pass it to him to keep it going.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you for the great intro. Yeah, once again, thank you everyone for joining and showing interest in this webinar. We're really excited to be able to share what we found in our study and also kind of just begin a conversation about roasting at various altitudes and also communication between people between those various altitudes. And so additionally, we just wanted to thank all the companies or groups that we work with. So Cropster, I work with Balzac Brothers, List and Beisler, Rob who's consulting, and then Ikawa for just kind of supporting and being on board with carrying out the study and letting us kind of explore some of our scientific sides and dive into this question. So just wanted to give a thank you to all those groups. And then also a huge thank you to all of the roasters who participated in this study. Literally, we couldn't have done this without you. So we just really wanted to thank you and kind of run through who participated in this study and roasted coffee for us. And so that would be Ceremony Coffee out of Annapolis, Maryland, Blended Coffee Club out of Sugar Land, Texas, Alabaster Coffee and Tea out of Williamsport, Pennsylvania, Calajero Coffee out of San Antonio, Texas, Indaba Coffee out of Spokane Valley, Washington, Doma Coffee out of Post Falls, Idaho, La Barba Coffee out of Salt Lake City, Treeline Coffee Roasters out of Bozeman, Dark Heart Coffee Bar out of lovely Colorado, and Daniel Mendoza, not a company, but works with Cropster.
Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, Daniel is out in Denver, Colorado, and then Iconic Coffee Roasters in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
And just to chime in there more, these people really did go through a lot to help us out. They had to deal with shipping stuff to them, and not only shipping, but setting up the Cropster ambient sensor, which is awesome, and just getting on the phone with us. And they really did go out of their way to help us out. So thank you so much. And you guys are just awesome. So, yeah.
Yeah. And so then also just out to the right of that, as you saw, those are all the C. If you go back one slide,
yes,
those are just, feet above sea level that each roastery is located at. So just kind of showing it there, but we'll show that again later once we dive into the actual study and the results of what we did. So, and so what are we here for today and what are we going to be talking about? That's a good question. And so we'll talk about that question. And so about, several months ago, Taylor and I were approached by Joe, who had this question about kind of what differences occur when you roast at various altitudes, but more specifically, kind of like how do you then communicate between roasteries or people who are roasting at different altitudes. And so I kind of wanted to let Joe kind of lead off this kind of what his question was originally, and how this branched out into the study that we did. So Joe, if you want to kind of take over here.
Yeah, definitely. So I get the cool opportunity to talk to roasters all the time about green coffee in particular, but then also how to present that green coffee to their customers. And I talk to roasters at all different elevations with all different machines, and I get asked all of the time, what should I do with coffee at 10,000 feet where I'm roasting, or wherever they're roasting. And this altitude question keeps popping up. And my answer is usually, well, roast it till it tastes good. Follow your palate. We have some ideas of how altitude can affect your roasting due to the pressure change, due to environmental challenges that you're under. But I don't have anything as concrete as I would like. Well, enter Ikawa and Cropster. Ikawa is a machine that is very easy to repeat a roast on and control, and to repeat a roast across multiple machines, which is key. And then Cropster allows us to data collect so that we can see exactly what is happening. So I had this idea that maybe we could somehow employ both of these groups to collect some data and to see if there is any insightful data that may show exactly that, firstly, that there are differences at altitude, secondly, what those differences are, and hopefully, thirdly, how to control those. So let's get into, Eric, a little bit about the initial questions we have to ask before we can even dig into the
the actual question itself.
Exactly.
And so, so when we're talking about altitude, there's several other questions, like Joe said, that you have to answer first. And so, Taylor, if you want to move to the next slide, those questions that kind of pop up are first and foremost something that I've been talking with some people quite a bit about, is kind of like, what are we talking about when we talk about altitude? Because a lot of folks, you'll see elevation and you'll see altitude, sometimes used interchangeably, and you'll see elevation on coffee bags. And so what are we actually talking about when we're talking about these two terms? And so I just want to kind of clear that up first to give an idea of what we're talking about. And so when we're talking about altitude, we're talking about the distance above sea level versus, the distance above sea level. And that is different than elevation, which is a fixed point on the Earth's surface. So that is the elevation is a point or object's feet above sea level on the Earth's surface. And so if we're talking about plants or where a coffee machine, roaster machine is actually placed, that would be an elevation. But when you're actually incorporating the atmospheric conditions, you're going to begin talking about altitude. And so a good example of kind of how you think about this is people can say, like, what elevation is considered high altitude is a good question or a way to remember this, because elevation, once again, is that fixed point, whereas altitude is kind of the atmospheric conditions. And we're often talking about something that is in the air above the Earth's surface. And so when we're talking about roasting, I think both terms are definitely applicable because you have a fixed point, and we're also incorporating the environmental conditions as well. And so in this study, we chose the term altitude because really a big driver in how the roasting process changes at various altitudes is the atmospheric pressure or the density of the air. And so that's kind of what we grab that question. So that kind of leads into the second question is, okay, what are the differences at various altitudes? And so the big one we focused on here is atmospheric pressure, really, because as you get higher up above the Earth's surface, gravity pulls down air molecules. And so you have less air, essentially less air molecules at higher altitudes. So that is going to change or influence how you can roast coffee because of differences in heat transfer. And then also just you have differences in environmental conditions as well. And then the third question is, why should we care about altitude if it doesn't change for our roastery? Because you have your roastery, it's one altitude. So why do you care? Because as Joe said, like, how do you roast at various altitudes? Well, just roast until like you find a profile that tastes good, essentially. But it's really important that we actually ask these questions because of the communication that is occurring more and more frequently now along the supply chain. And so, Joe, if you wanted to talk a bit like why should people care if their roastery altitude doesn't change?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people kind of dreaming of this future where we can exchange roast profiles very readily for, like, let's say an Ikawa. Let's say I have a client that has an Ikawa that they're roasting samples on, and then I have an Ikawa that I'm roasting samples on, and the farmer that we're buying from also has an Ikawa that they're roasting samples on. Well, if we all share the exact same profile, if we all use something like third wave water with distilled water, then we think automatically that we're all tasting the exact same thing. Whereas we're not really seeing things as clearly as we should, because it's very, very likely that me sitting here at 900 feet versus a farmer who's sitting at maybe 3,000 feet versus another roaster who may be at sea level are going to be roasting in very different conditions. So if that roaster is roasting at sea level and they have some feedback about the coffee at that exact profile, that feedback may come through to one of the others of us as, oh, they're tasting the coffee wrong, or something's wrong with the coffee, something changed in transit, whereas it could literally just be the profile. So eliminating variables is extremely important when we discuss communication, especially about a target on a coffee. So the more variables we understand, the more that we can eliminate those variables and control for them. And cupping, data exchange along the supply chain is all about eliminating those variables and control.
Yeah, and that's a actually beautiful lead into the next slide of, okay, so what are we aiming for then with this study? And as you said, we're aiming kind of to begin to understand what variables within the roasting process are changing at various locational elevations or at different altitudes. And then kind of even a bigger question is, okay, at various, if you understand these variables and you can adjust for them, and you create profiles at various altitudes that do create the same roasted coffee, are there still kind of sensory differences or organoleptic qualities that we notice that are different? So yeah, so that's kind of a big question that we had. And so that kind of then breaks it down into, we developed these long-term objectives of what we want to achieve from this study. And so we started out definitely pretty bold in what all of our objectives were that we wanted to achieve. And we quickly realized that we couldn't do it all at one time. It was definitely a much broader project than what we had originally had hoped to do. So Taylor, if you want to move that next slide. Yeah, and so Joe, if you want to jump in on any of these were kind of the long-term objectives that we mapped out that we wanted to achieve. First and foremost, kind of identifying if differences occur in the roasting process for a single coffee roasted at different altitudes using the same profile and the same roasting machine. The second one being identify if differences in quality exist for that same coffee at different altitudes using the same profile and the same machine. The third being identify if differences in the roasting process exist between coffee produced in different regions and with different processing methods due to coffee being roasted at different elevations or in different altitudes. The fourth being identify if differences occur in quality between coffee produced in different regions and with different processing methods due to the coffee being roasted at different elevations. And then the fifth being expose if there are variables that are influenced by variations in altitude to better understand how to improve coffee roasting and cup quality. And so with all of these questions, or all these objectives that we had, like I said, we definitely could not do it all at once. These are big things to ask and it would require a lot of work. And so what we wanted to do is kind of break this down and focus on what we can do to begin this conversation. So if Taylor, you can go to the next slide. And then, yeah, Joe, if you kind of want to talk about how we then broke this where we started.
So we're thinking about this in terms of a 3-step approach. Step 1, understanding a single roast profile at various altitudes. So we'll kind of get into the ins and outs of how we accomplish this, but I think you can kind of gather from the slides that we saw earlier with all of the different roasters at different altitudes. Step 2 is to understand how to match roasting profiles at these altitudes. So for instance, if we have varying altitudes and we see that the roast is really varying, how can we send out a profile to each of those altitudes that would then result in the exact same coffee at the end? So the first one is what are the different profiles? The second one is how can we create a variation on those profiles, kind of a priori ahead of time, send that out, and then nail the exact same profile. Step 3 is evaluate coffees roasted the same at various altitudes for quality differences. And that's kind of, that step 3 is going to be the approach for each one of the experiments basically that we do. So I guess we can move to that next slide. So basically we just used our first experiment here to focus on this first part of our question.
Yeah.
So that's what you're joining us for here today. So I just want to say, like, up front, at the end of this, you're not going to have an answer as to how to roast at your altitude. You're just scratching the surface on this question. Even for the machine that we're working with, the specific machine that we're working with the Ikawa and the specific coffee. So there are a lot more layers to the onion that we'll peel back, hopefully, as the future rolls on.
Yep. Yeah. And so that first question leads us into the actual study itself. What did we do and how did we carry out this study? As kind of to break down the study, it's in 3 phases we did it, essentially breaking down to the preparation, the actual roasting of the coffees, and then the evaluation, which was carried out by Rob. And so to start that out, we'll kind of talk about the preparation and how that led into the roasting. And so first and foremost, we've been talking about Ikawa quite a lot already, because that is the machine that we kind of settled on using for this study because of its ability to create repeatable roasts, transfer profiles, and also just it being widely used at different elevations because several roasters have it. But I know some of you might not be familiar with Ikawa or too familiar at least. And so I wanted to bring on Alex to actually talk about the Ikawa and explain a little bit about how it functions differently than a typical drum sample roaster or a typical just roasting machine. So Alex, if you wanted to share or talk a little bit about the Ikawa to kind of fill in the participants on what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to join and thanks for the introduction.
Yeah.
Ikawa really seeks to improve coffee for coffee professionals through the supply chain, including producers, roasters, traders, and trainers. And so the vision that Joe shared earlier on in this webinar is something that we absolutely share as well. And that's one of the real reasons we were so happy to support this piece of research. We help to improve coffee through improving accessibility to information about coffee qualities. And our sample roasters are used to make good sample roasting more and more accessible because basically it simplifies the process. The machines are app controlled, which means you can program the roaster with your roaster profile and the roaster will automatically follow your desired profile. So it creates consistency, it creates repeatability and reproducibility, and it's hands-free, so it's obviously time-saving. But in the context of this research, we're really pleased to support because obviously we have users in probably 80 to 90 countries worldwide using the roasters for sample evaluation, also using it for profiling and competition. You know, like the quality of roast you can achieve is very high. People use it for brewing or barista competitions as well, because you can really dial in your roast to be exactly how you like it for any particular coffee. But in terms of this project, you can see the image here shows the roast chamber from above, and it shows, you can just about see the temperature sensor, which measures the exhaust air of the air leaving the roasting chamber. Ikawa roasters you can control either by an exhaust profile, where the roaster will ensure that the exhaust temperature matches your prescribed demand, or the inlet temperature sensor can control the roast, which will mean that the roaster always puts in the prescribed amount of temperature into the roast. I think the roast graphs will be shown a little later, and the data then integrates with Cropster or is viewable on the app for review later in your process. I think that's probably enough to talk about for now.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there are a lot of expert Ikawa users on this call, and I know that there's some on the panel too. So I'll leave it for now.
Awesome, thank you, Alex. So that's a bit about Ikawa, and that is the machine that we had decided to utilize for this study. And so, Taylor, if you actually want to bump back to slide 12, yeah. So we got together a team of Ikawa users or roasters located in the United States at various altitudes. And to begin this study, what we did then is we used coffee from Balzac Brothers, the company that I work for, a coffee from Guatemala, and we sent each roaster about 150 grams of that coffee not 150, about a pound of that coffee, so that they could roast that coffee 3 times for 3 different profiles. And so what those 3 profiles are, Taylor, I'm not sure if your screen.
Yeah, this is beautiful. Oh, there we go.
And so we roasted, we shared then that coffee with all the participants of the study. And then we additionally provided them instructions on profiles to use and how to then handle that coffee and then send that coffee to Rob, so that we're controlling for variations that might occur in the roasting process. So essentially, each person at a different altitude roasted each roasted the coffee with 3 different profiles, a light, a medium, and a dark profile. They roasted it 3 times, and then we sent it off to Rob to be evaluated. And then additionally, what roasters also received was an ambient sensor from Cropster. And what an ambient sensor does is you can set that up in your roastery to monitor your roasting environment. And so what this actually measures is, and we'll show later, is ambient pressure, the ambient humidity, and the ambient temperature. And these are 3 things that you can then focus on to kind of better understand the environment that you are roasting in and maybe how that changes. And for us, that was super important to understand, okay, how are these different Ikawa users, how are their environments different, and how does that influence then kind of how that coffee gets roasted. And so kind of moving on from that phase 1. So we then sent out those coffees with the ambient sensors. Each of the roasters received them. They roasted them using the 3 profiles 3 times each, and then they were sent off. And so on the next slide, we kind of just show the 3 different roast profiles that we used in Ikawa. So on the left, you see the 3 profiles, the light, the medium, and the dark. And so you can see the points, and if you wanted to replicate or have these profiles, A, you could create them yourself, or B, you can reach out to me and I can share them with you through the Ikawa app, which is located or shown on the right. That is the light profile that we have. And so with these 3 profiles, what we're trying to do is better understand how does coffee maybe change at various altitudes if you're roasting light, medium, and dark. So we kind of want to hit the full spectrum of where folks might be roasting. And so then that we could begin to understand those differences that are occurring. And so what those profiles then actually look like, which is really cool because Ikawa can also be integrated into Cropster. And so as Joe is mentioning, it's really useful to be able to then gather that data that is occurring during the roasting process. And so on the next slide, we can see that the 3 profiles are going to have, the idea is that we wanted to roast them pretty similarly, but kind of just stretch out the time or hopefully potentially even the development or the final roast color of those coffees. And so you'll see here kind of the roast profile A, which is the light roast profile, B, which is the medium, and roast profile C, which is the dark here shown. And so you'll see like differences in how long those roasts were, ranging from just about 6.5 minutes to 8 minutes to right around 9 minutes there. And so once everybody, all the participants roasted those coffees, as I said, they sent them off to Rob, who then evaluated those coffees. And so I will then pass this to Rob to talk a little bit about data collection and what he did with recording or evaluating the coffee.
Eric.
Oh,
Eric,
hi, everybody. Oh, good. Go out.
Eric, just on the previous slide.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry, Rob. It might be worth just highlighting the two different graphs that you've got there, because I think that the lower graphs is the one that was used to control the roast, the exhaust temperature one, and the higher one with the higher peaks is a reflection of the heat that was added to the roast to achieve the outcomes.
Yeah, that is 100% correct. Do you want me to expand on that? Or actually, are you making
This is me.
Okay, I'll say someone's making a note on it. So Rob, actually, if you want to just take that on, then you can lead in data collection.
Yeah, sure thing. So as Alex mentioned, these are exhaust profiles. We've got potentially V3s and V2s in the mix, and both of them are capable of looping off of the exhaust curve. The V3 gives you the ability to loop off exhaust and inlet. When I say loop, I mean there's what's called a PID loop, which basically helps the computer to anticipate what to do in order to make sure that it's hitting profile. So when you're running the profile, or the profile is being controlled by the machine off of exhaust, then it's trying to mimic here, whatever is built into the Ikawa for that roast. And if it's looping off of inlet, it's trying to follow whatever was programmed in up here. So those are just kind of the variations. And then this line that goes up big and then comes down is your rate of rise, just as a heads up for anybody who's not seen it. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so I got a mountain of samples sent to me, and we did data collection on that mountain of samples. So what I used to do the data collection was a Lightel CM100, as well as an Espresso Vision. So you'll see data whole bean and ground for the Lightels, and then you'll see only ground for the Espresso Vision. Each of these to make sure that we were getting good measurements. For each coffee, I took 3 whole bean measurements from different spots in the bag, and then I took 3 ground measurements as well, dumping them out and refilling it every single time. And then, so that would be for the Lightels, I'd do 3 whole bean, 3 ground, and then I would do 3 Espresso Vision. So for each roast that was sent to me, I took 9 color meter readings at least. If something looked fishy, I knew that I had positioned the color meter wrong, and so I'd recheck. So at least 9 per roast. There were 3 roasts per group, and there were supposedly 15 groups sending it to me. So I pushed a lot of buttons and ground a lot of coffee, and it was great. Let's go on to the next slide here.
Sorry to jump in here, but Rob, can you talk a little bit about how we decided or why we decided to come to use roast color instead of cupping all of these coffees?
Yes. So here's part of it. So there is a lot of evidence and a lot of data that shows that roast color is one of the primary predictors of flavor in coffee. There's a really awesome paper written by Morton Munchau in the Beverages magazine, not magazine, it's like a scientific publication, but you could look it up and see it, and it's got some really cool data. There are also charts and graphs in there as well, which is always good for coffee people, right? But the reason we did that too is cupping can be very difficult to do scientifically well. And so this was kind of a first step, like, let's see what the differences are objective measurement wise. Like, the color is the color, so we'll take the color measurement, weight loss is weight loss, that sort of thing. And then the plan was to move on from there eventually. If the color doesn't match, the flavor is not going to match. So this was kind of a much easier way of seeing how close or far off it was going to be. And then the reason they were all sent to me is because even if everyone that was measuring it had the exact same device, Lightel CM100, your sample preparation can actually change your color meter readings quite a bit. So how full you fill the little receptacle is actually going to change your whole bean reading and how full you fill the ground receptacle is going to change your grind reading. So you have to make sure you're doing it all very, very similarly every single time. And so we just thought it was easier in terms of data point taking for us to just have me do it, because I'm doing it the same way every single time. I know how to standardize what I'm doing. But if you gave it to someone else, there could be shifts in data points just because we have a different way of preparing the sample. So in as much as we want to talk about everything being perfect, everything is never perfect. So we just try and eliminate as many variables as we can to get it as perfect as we can. So, and here you can see 3 data points measured for whole bean, 3 data points measured for ground. And I calculated an average whole bean color and an average ground color for each of those. That's going to be the data we're looking at now. There's a lot of back-end data that we didn't put in the slides because it was just a lot of noise that gets us around our main point. And then 3 data points for each and an average ground here for each. So let's go on to the next one. All of these coffees were ground on the Niche 0 coffee grinder. I had it, if you go to the next slide, sorry. All of them were ground on setting 15, which is a fine espresso grind setting. A lot of people always ask me, why do you do a fine setting when you're doing your color meter readings? The reason for that is the coarser the grind sample, the closer it's going to get to the whole bean color. The finer the grind sample, the further away from the whole bean color it's going to get, because what's happening is the finer you grind it, the more you're averaging out the color of the whole bean and ground. Ground isn't necessarily an interior color meter reading, it is a reading of the average color of the coffee. So we get whole bean, which is exterior color, and then we get ground, which is an average color. So we wanted to maximize the amount of averaging that's happening, so we ground it really fine so that it would maximize that amount of averaging. And the reason why we went with that approach. So I do all my color meter readings on 15, so that's why I went with 15.
Yep, definitely. And then just quickly, once again, listing then all the data that Rob actually collected. These are the folks that were able to roast the coffees and send them to Rob, and we were able to get data from. And then once again, the feet above sea level. And so in the charts that will follow, you'll see these folks listed as codes or acronyms for their names, but in the charts they are still listed in the same order. So essentially, on the left, you'll have at sea level or right near sea level, all the way up to right around 70 to 100 feet above sea level for iconic coffee roasters. And so what did we actually find? And so leading off, we're just going to kind of show the actual ambient sensor data that was collected by the ambient sensors provided each roastery. And so you'll see here, which was a nice relief to know that there is in fact a decrease in ambient pressure as you move to higher altitudes. And so on the left, once again, you have ceremony coffee roasters at about 40 feet above sea level, has the highest ambient pressure, and you see a reduction in that pressure when you get to iconic in Santa Fe at about 7,200 feet above sea level. And
one thing that I'll say about this real quick is mind that the pressure that these roasters are under is also in the real world. And so weather patterns can change barometric pressure a little bit. So you may not see a direct, descending as things go up. And that's probably due to some other kinds of weather conditions and things like that, which, as studies like this become more and more fine-tuned, then it could even be possible, I believe, that you could make adjustments for that barometric pressure within your own roasting facility. Back to you.
Yeah, no, and then once again, I didn't even mention the units that we're using here are hectopascals. So not bars, but pascals. And so you see the reduction there. And so, yeah. And then the other thing we measured is average ambient humidity of the coffee roasting environments. The idea here is that as you increase in humidity, you have more water in the air. And as there's more water in the air, that is going to change heat transfer, or the ability to, not the ability, but at least how the dynamics of that roast function. And so you'll see there's actually a pretty good spread here of the average humidity that occurred. So yeah, but we can talk more about that later. And then the third thing that was measured is average ambient temperature. And so everybody is pretty close to somewhere between about just under 80 degrees Fahrenheit to low 70 degrees Fahrenheit to upper 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So Pretty similar there, nothing too crazy. And then we'll bounce it back to Rob to talk about actually what he found.
Yeah, so this was a lot of fun. So the color measurements came out. You can see the ground being up here at the top, the whole bean here in the middle, and then the values from the Espresso Vision, it's Roast Vision by the company Espresso Vision down here below. And so what I included just for everybody's mutual benefit is a trend line. And so you can see that the lightest roasted coffees were by the lower altitude folks. And as we went up in altitude, the coffees actually drifted a little bit darker. Now, this is the Agtron scale, so keep in mind that lower scores equal darker, higher scores equal lighter. If you were using color track scale, it would be flipped around backwards. And so basically we have light to dark, light to dark, light to dark in terms of our trend line data and in terms of kind of the overall measurements for the light roast here. If we can go on to the next slide. We see the exact same sort of trend lines following the medium roast, light to dark, light to dark, light to dark. And then for the dark roast, ding. There we go, thank you. For those of you who grew up with books on tape, and it would ding when you turn the page, I don't know if you remember that. But once again, for the dark roast, we went from lighter to darker, kind of across the board again, so not to repeat. But what's really fun about all of this here, and we can go to the next slide for this, is it actually, it does make sense. And this is something that we kind of figured might happen going into it. And the reason for that is just because of the mechanics of how the Ikawa works and just how most roasters work in general. As you go up in altitude, the fan is going to be spinning at the same rate, but the density of the air that you're moving is going to be quite a bit different. And with the density difference in the air, it is going to cause some differences in terms of how the roaster is going to roast the coffee. Because especially with the Ikawa, remember, we're not measuring bean temperature, we're measuring inlet temperature, so the temperature of the air coming into the chamber, and we're measuring exhaust temperature, the temperature of the air going out of the chamber. And so it is not looping based on the actual bean temperature. And so we are going to see some wiggling happen because as the pressure decreases, it's going to simulate something else that we saw in some research I did for one of my Ikawa classes. So if you go to the next slide here, it'll showcase what happens. It simulates kind of what happens when you adjust the fan speed. So I did 3 roasts with the same exact exhaust profile, 85%, 75%, and 65%. And you can see that we actually tracked really, really well in terms of our exhaust profile curve here. Really, really great reproduction. Well done, Alex. You all did a good job with the PID loops. And but what we do see happening is we decrease the fan speed in order for the exhaust thermocouple to read this temperature. The inlet temperature has to increase. And I do need to make a note that because I needed to get the green coffee moving, I did have them all at 85% fan speed until about 2.5 minutes. That's why you see them with the exact same temperature until here, because then the beans were light enough that they could actually spin at 65%. Otherwise, I would have just had some really not well roasted beans. But anyhow, and so what we see happening, let me grab my little marker here, because I don't know if you can see my mouse since I'm not presenting. So, it's okay if you can't. Yeah, I've been pointing at stuff this whole time, so just ignore that. So the difference between 75% and 85% isn't tremendous. So 75% being the yellow line and this red line up here being, 85% being the yellow line and 75% being the red line. When we drop down to 65% though, we do see a pretty tremendous difference in terms of the temperature of the inlet air coming in. So in order to push the coffee into first crack and to get it to carry on, the inlet temperature had to spike pretty dramatically, which actually caused us to hit first crack remarkably sooner than the other two, which were grouped somewhat more closely together. And it's no surprise, right? You push your burner, you get to first crack a little bit faster. Okay, so no real shocker there. These two are a little bit closer together. And then all of them roasted out and finished. So if we go to the next slide, you can see the roast data on that. And I won't annotate here because y'all can see it. So what's pretty great is the 75 and the 85% weren't terribly different. Okay, 0.2 points of Agtron color is pretty much nothing in the grand scheme of things. Now, both of these were so light, I listed them both at 110 Agtron Gourmet, and the reason it's 110 is because the CM100 has a limitation. 110 is as light as you can go, measurement-wise, and that's it. I'm now rocking the CM200, so I can go quite a bit lighter. But what's tremendously different is when you look at that 65%. That 65% drops us now suddenly to 60 Agtron, which is tremendously darker, and 92.6 Agtron, which is also tremendously darker to the 110 plus that I was getting before. So this is probably more than a 10-point jump, I would guess, in terms of, or close to a 10-point jump in terms of the ground Agtron reading. And then we've got a 6-point Agtron jump here, which are both very, very significant. Most of the time, if I'm trying to do profile matching for a client, I'm usually aiming for plus or minus 3 Agtron points at the very maximum in order to land somewhere close to where they're going. And so for me to be hitting 6 points of Agtron difference and or close to 10, I would guarantee that there are incredibly large taste differences between these coffees. So when we look at the data that we collected from all of the roasters, you know, we have, I'm taking a quick glance so that I can tell you some numbers. You know, on roast A, you know, the coffee from Ceremony was at 62.9 and the coffee from Iconic was at 55.4 in terms of whole bean. In terms of the ground measurement, we went from 111 down to 96. So pretty big differences just in terms, and that's just one roast. That's roast A and comparing the two extremes. So
yeah, if you could go back to roast A on slide 27.
So yeah, as they're going back to that slide, I just kind of will wrap it up like this. So, you know, when we talk, and I saw a question come up in the Q&A, so I just kind of want to touch on that too. Although maybe it clicked as answered already. Yeah, Joe, you already answered it. Well done. Okay, well, never mind. So the question was, shouldn't coffee cups simulate if the roast curve and rate of rise are identical regardless of altitude? And Joe's answer is great. I'm just going to read out loud so everybody sees it. Yes, if the roast actually roasts this coffee the same way. No, if the roasts are different due to altitude, which is what we're trying to find out. And it's not just different due to altitude, but we're actually getting different readings. So if we had a bean temperature probe in there that was measuring the bean temperature would actually be showing completely different readings as well. And not to make people distrust their bean temperature sensors, but bean temperature sensors are also kind of faulty, because if your air temperature is significantly higher or lower, it can actually skew your bean temperature reading up and down. So currently in coffee, unless we're doing some sort of like scientific drill a little tiny hole in the bean, put a little thermocouple in there and suspend it between glass mesh and blast it with air, we're only getting approximations ever on any coffee roasting machine for the actual temperature of the beans. So there's always going to be just a little bit of wiggle. So, and Eric, did y'all figure out what the slide thing you're doing is? Right, go ahead.
Sorry, again, you cut out there.
Sorry, I was going to say, I like to say that the temperature probe is usually only telling its own temperature. It's not telling the actual air temperature or the bean temperature. So a temperature probe can lie to you about what is happening in real time with the coffee, and pressure itself changes chemistry. So the bean itself will chemically change at different rates due to higher or lower pressure on it, which altitude definitely will affect that, as well as the moisture in the environment, which we saw on that reading earlier. So there are a lot of things at play here, and just eliminating down to the one thing that we're focusing on, we're still seeing major change.
Yeah,
Cool, we can jump ahead here.
Yeah. And so kind of then just bringing this all back to where do we go from here and summarizing that. So as Rob was talking about, we noticed a noticeable difference between the 3 roast profiles at various altitudes. And a lot of that, once again, I want to touch upon is kind of a function of how we set up the study and the profiles that we used, because we were in those profiles, they were set to measure on the Ikawa exhaust temperature. But if we utilize the inlet probe and adjusted for that, it would be different, or at least the results would likely be different. because I know, Alex, you were mentioning that quite a bit, and Rob touched upon that as well. And that's important to note. And so then how does this play into where we go from here? And so the hope, as we had from the beginning, was that we can utilize this as kind of a jumping off point to understand that there are going to be differences between how a machine functions at different altitudes, and additionally how the physics of that roasting environment are going to change because of differences in atmospheric pressure. And when you communicate, or when people communicate at various altitudes, so somebody, maybe a roaster at sea level, and then a producer or exporter that could be 3,000 feet, 5,000 feet above sea level, that they are understanding that there are differences that are likely occurring if they're sharing profiles, or if they're talking about profiles on the same machine. That is not always a direct comparison, that there are other things you have to account for. And so there are definitely, as we've talked about, limitations of what we did here, because it is very focused in on utilizing just in Ikawa, and just within how we develop those profiles. And so if we want to go to the next slide, if possible, kind of what those limitations are is, we only used one roasting machine here, and a sample roaster that is utilizing convection primarily. There's also conductive heat transfer between those beans, but it's this study, or how these profiles would be affected if it was using a typical sample roaster that is a drum roaster, or even if we used actual machines that are much, much larger, the results could likely be different. So this is just focused in on utilizing an Ikawa that is measuring the profile differences, or running profiles based on the exhaust temperature.
Yeah. One quick note from an attendee as well, which I think is worth mentioning at this point. One of the other limitations is that we were not able to control in the study if they were V2 or V3 Ikawas.
Right.
And we weren't able to make sure that they were completely synchronized with each other. So if they were all at the same altitude, everything would be perfect. This study was a lot more like proof of concept oriented than we're going to publish this in a scientific journal. But for future studies, that does need to happen. Like, we would potentially need to buy like a rent time at a diving decompression chamber, pop an outlet in there, and just have like one Ikawa roasting inside that decompression chamber at a time. I think that would probably give us a little bit more accurate. But yeah, I mean, so that is definitely a limitation. However, the trending actually followed expectations based on just what we understood in terms of how the machine functioned, which kind of showed us that there was a decent proof of concept there. But that's an absolutely excellent point. And as we've talked about sharing machines between people too, you also have to keep that into consideration, is that you can't necessarily send a sample from, or a profile from your V3 in your lab at sea level to a farmer on a V2 or V3, which might have a calibrated or uncalibrated fan at a different part of, in terms of altitude. So just got to pay close attention to that.
Yeah. Secondly, or building off of what Rob was saying, this is also a very small sample size. If you were to want to publish this or do any more analysis on it, you would ideally have many more roaster participants, or, as Rob had mentioned, do this in a decompression chamber and run several more samples to be able to draw just more data. Additionally, we only used color analysis, so we didn't do any cupping of these coffees or measure any of the differences in the actual nutrients in that roasted coffee. So differences maybe like acids that occurred, or like perception of sweetness in those coffees could potentially be different. And so that is something we did not measure. And then additionally, kind of being cautious in how you translate this to lessons, how you translate these lessons or what we're talking about to larger roasting machines. It's not a direct comparison. There are definitely going to be differences that are occurring. So it's just be cautious there. So yeah. And then after that, kind of the potential next steps. So going back to what we had talked about at the beginning, what Joe was talking about is we would love to see this further expanded out into understanding how to match these roasting profiles at altitude. So if you begin to actually use potentially inlet temperature, can you match these profiles at various altitudes so that the actual roasting events were occurring at the same time? So so that you're ideally creating the same roasts. And then you can move on to step 3 is then if you're creating the same roasts or you're able to adjust based on your altitude, you're able to adjust that profile to the same. Are there differences that are occurring in the quality of that coffee? You would hope that there aren't, but you would want to test that as well so that you could understand that. And if those profiles are the same, they get roasted the same, and then the quality is the same, then you can begin to actually have those conversations at various altitudes between folks at sea level and 3,000 up or wherever. That is kind of where ideally we would want this to go and would be next steps. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, and so that's kind of where we're just gonna end off or finish off here. We are going to open this up to questions after this because I know you all have quite a bit. And so we'll answer some of those. So yeah, thank you once again for everybody who did join. And if you have any additional questions outside of what we're gonna answer here, feel free to reach out to any of us. We are happy to talk more about this. I'm additionally happy to share any of the roast profiles that we use or kind of just the methods of what we went into this. We can nerd out and talk about it all day. So yeah, feel free to reach out. I don't know, Taylor, you want to throw up the slide really quickly of just all of our emails so folks can reach out. Yeah, so those are our contacts if you want to reach out to me, Taylor, Rob, or Joe. Yeah, we're happy to talk.
So we have a question in the chat here. This is fun. You guys can all take a crack at it. It says, does this have a specific hypothesis that you could share or overall conclusion?
I guess I'll take that. Yes to the hypothesis. We do have that listed. We did not share that here, but I have that in a document where we have an entire document that we built out at the very beginning that has the study procedures, the hypothesis, the aim, the objectives, and how we would actually, the methods of the study. So I can share that if you want to email me or share your email. And then can you repeat the second part of that question?
Yeah, I think just an overall conclusion, I think was the question.
I think the wrap up would be very specific. So it is when roasting on an Ikawa at different altitudes using an exhaust profile curve, you should expect lower altitude roasting to give you a lighter roast and higher altitude roasting to give you a darker roast color. But it's very specific.
Or the same coffee on.
Yes. Exactly. So if you're on an Ikawa and you're roasting and you decide to go on a van trip up the mountain, you would have to have a different profile for the bottom of the mountain than the top of the mountain.
Yeah, just to add to that, and Rob, I don't know if you have insight. Often, as Rob explained, the reason that at a higher altitude the roast comes out darker is because the roast is applying more heat to achieve the same exhaust curve because the air density is lighter. And that was the insight behind the suggestion that if you were to use the inlet curve to control the roast, it would eliminate the system as the variable, and it would give you more visibility of the actual impact of the air pressure and the altitude itself. So that's a future route. But I think from my understanding of Ikawa users' experience at altitude, they tend to dial in their roast by increasing the airflow. That seems to be the most simple step that users take to create a dialed in altitude profile on exhaust. Rob, do you agree that that's the kind of first port of call?
Yes, for sure. And to your point too, and this is, you missed an upsell moment, Alex. If you have a V2, you should send it to Alex and have him convert it to a V3, because the same exact experiment that I did with the same roaster, same coffee on the exhaust curve profile side and got these big differences on the inlet profile. So when you're running it off of inlet, 85% fan speed was a 66.5 agtron and a 109.1 ground. The 65% fan speed was only a 64.3 agtron and a 109.6 ground. So there was no difference in the ground coffee color between 85% fan speed and 65% fan speed, and only 2.3 points of color difference between the whole bean colors at 85% fan speed versus 65. So my theory would be that if we retested this with the inlet curve as the controller, we would see a lot less significant difference between the final roast colors, even at altitudes. It's just my guess. So, yeah. 100%.
Okay, great.
Yes, adjust fan speed up if you go up in altitude.
Yes. Rob,
Just like you're breathing. You have to breathe more up there too. Same thing.
Awesome. Well, I think we'll call it there, guys. This is going to be available on Cropster's YouTube in just about an hour, sir. And if anybody wants the slides, please feel free to email me at taylor@cropster.com. Be happy to share them with you. Thank you so much again for everybody showing up. Thank you to our panelists. You guys are incredible. I'm just I can't believe we got this done. It was so many months ago that we started this idea. We nailed it. You guys killed it. I was happy to just sit back and watch. So thank you so much again, guys. And yeah, hopefully we'll see all of us here again sometime soon.
Cool. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
See you, everybody.
Take care.
Cheers.